Yeah, so Mavash can hear me. Mavash, can you just confirm that you can hear Charlie?
Can you hear me, Mabash? Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay, excellent. Well, not to delay, I'm going to start because we've just gone past 8 o'clock here in the UK. So as before, the agenda is going to be a real quick introduction to myself and Charlie and a quick introduction to the topic. And then at about 10 past 8, we're going to open the floor for questions and sharing. So again, just be mindful of what you ask and what you share. But please feel free to add. We had some really great learnings from people on the call last week. So please feel free to add. So brief introduction. Charlie, if you introduce yourself.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your time. We always appreciate you investing part of your time to be part of the PSM forum. I'm Charlie Wickstrom, a mechanical engineer, been working on process safety for the last 20 years. And we are basically really glad to have this kind of opportunity to share what we can share with you, all of you. Thanks a lot for being here.
Yeah, and my name is Louise Whiting, and I am chairing these process safety forums. As Charlie said, we're really excited to be able to have this time with you to answer any questions you might have about the topic. I know that this time slot is not ideal for some time zones, and so we're next week, really exciting. We're running the first session at noon in the UK to accommodate other time zones. And so I've been working for about 11 years in operators, and now I run my own business, and I'm a professional process safety engineer with quite a lot of operations experience. Okay, so today's topic is temporary change. So some of you on the call may be very familiar with temporary change and others may not. So I'm going to give a real brief introduction, and then we're going to go into the questions. If anyone thinks of a question in the meantime, please feel free to type it in. Remember to click on the question mark, and we'll answer them as soon as we get to the end of the slides. So what is a temporary change? So typically temporary changes are classified as those that last less than 12 months. It's normally something that's unforeseen, although it can be something planned. It could be a trial for a high cost or high risk activity. So for example, if you're thinking about optimizing the plant, you might want to have a trial to see whether you would be able to achieve an increased throughput. And so you may trial with some overrides on for a short period to confirm before you invest the money. Or there might be some other reason why you need to override something, and that might be your temporary period. It could be a very high risk activity. So you may need to do something, an intervention you can't isolate or something like that. There might be a special reason, and you might need to do a temporary change. There's also things like if some of your equipment wasn't working very well, but you're very close to a normal turnaround point, rather than bringing the turnaround forward by, say, 5 or 10 days, which would upset the planning, you may put in a temporary change to carry you over until the main turnaround. Or it could be due to obsolescence. So you may be operating an older plant and some of your equipment may become obsolete. It may have broken down and you might not realize, and you may need to do something temporary in the meantime. So I've been dealing with temporary change for a long time, and these are some of the most common issues that I have seen in temporary change, but feel free to share other things as we go through the call, or ask questions about anything else that you want to. So temporary change typically has a smaller approval group or a subset of the management of change panel. If you don't know what management of change panel is, please feel free to ask and we can explain in the question and answer. But because of the nature of the change, or it can be classed as an emergency change or a temporary change, it can be approved by a smaller subset of the management of change panel. Typically, I've seen temporary changes not documented very well. Okay, so because it's seen as temporary, we see that maybe, well, it'll only be for a couple of days, so we don't need to write things down. Sometimes that happens, and actually sometimes it hangs on for quite a long time. Temporary changes sometimes don't get closed out, and we can talk about what temporary change closeout means, because it's quite different for closeout of a normal management of change. Almost 100% of times, temporary changes have lasted longer than we planned them to last. So if we thought it was going to be 1 month, it's 2 months. If we thought it was going to be 6 months, it's 18 months. Doesn't matter what we planned, it's normally more than what we thought. And a lot of them actually become permanent changes without us even realizing. And then because of the urgent nature, people sometimes don't feel the need to follow the same rigor. Now, sometimes there's no time because you might need to do something in a very short period, but you need to follow the same steps, even if it's not to the same detail, so that you can make a good decision. And then when the time allows, after the change has been implemented, you re-review, and there is a period for you can readjust how you've implemented the change. So the last thing I want to share is, well, what does good look like, right? So these are the problems with temporary MOC. What could good look like? Well, good could be executing and using the full MOC process, right? The most important thing when you do any management of change is to do a thorough risk assessment. Now, just because you're doing a temporary MOC doesn't mean that you shouldn't do a risk assessment. The risk assessment panel might not have the same sort of occupancy or number of people, but you need to do a risk assessment. You need to understand the risk that you are taking implementing this change. So using the full MOC process, it might be with less people, but still following all the stages is a really good practice for temporary MOCs. Making sure it's clearly documented. Sometimes, because it could be of an urgent nature, you might document everything on paper, followed up by electronic later. Okay, but in a lot of organizations, they prefer not to do that now because the electronic allows for a timestamp, and it also allows for some remote review by technical authorities or engineering specialists. There is a process for articulating it to each shift. So if you were on the shift that the temporary change was implemented, that's great news because you'll know all about it. But if you're on the next shift or on the night shift, you might not know what this temporary change was, and then you might do something thinking that the process is operating as normal, not realizing there's this temporary change which increases the risk of your facility. Temporary changes have an expiry date, right? And by this, I mean that you actually adhere to the expiry date. If you need to extend it, that's fair enough. That's really not a problem. But the management need to be aware of the expiry date. They need to push people to say, do we really need to extend this? Why haven't you done anything since you first implemented this? There needs to be that management pushback saying, look, you've asked me for a temporary change here. You're going over the deadline. What did you do? Why haven't you met it? The next one is a permanent solution is planned to be implemented before the temporary change expires. So quite often you need to do something temporary, as I said, to just get you over something that has arisen which is unexpected. Maybe you don't have the right parts or whatever. But you need to have a permanent solution in which needs to be implemented before the temporary change expires. And if it's not going to be implemented, you need to be asking for extension earlier rather than later. Don't wait for it to expire. That's what good looks like. It means that you understand your process, you understand the risks, and you're planning for best. And then the last one is that they are closed out. So I've seen facilities where there's loads of temporary changes open, and some of them have moved on, they're no longer in service. They need to be closed out. All temporary documentation needs to be removed from the facility, and things need to be put back to what they were before the change was implemented. That's what temporary change closeout means. A system goes back to what it was before, right? If you then do a subsequent change, which does a permanent change, that's different. But temporary change means it goes back to what it was before. So you don't leave any part of it implemented. So that's all I've got today. So if any of you on the line have any questions, Charlie and I will keep an eye on Facebook and YouTube because this is also streaming live there. If you have any questions, please let me know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it with a question to Charlie. So Charlie, in your experience, what is one of the biggest issues with regards to temporary change? And can you give us an example of when temporary change was implemented well on one of your facilities?
Well, unfortunately, I have more I remember more times that we did it wrong than the times that we did it right. But basically, we have a joke in operations that we call temporary forever, because it's what happened. In many cases, we do changes for a temporary basis. And because of the perception on the MOC process, people doesn't want to go through the process and they prefer to do the temporary change. And then basically is everything verbally agreed. And we are facing, I think, that quite a lot of these scenarios, especially during this season, when many companies are doing their turnarounds, and you start finding problems and you start having this temporary change. One thing that I usually try to discuss with any crew is we need to understand the process and the value of the process. Sometimes it's difficult to follow, let's say, the process on their system, on the platform that they have implemented, but that is not a reason to not go through the process of risk assess the change, agreed on certain time as what we call, let's say, time for checks during that temporary change. There are certain things that can be agreed and can be done without necessarily going through the whole system, and after they can just have everything right on the system based on whatever is implemented. Anyways, so far we are facing more and more problem with this. People is in a rush. Everybody wants to everyone wants to keep producing, and basically temporary changes are coming more and more. We found certain companies that have quite a good practice on temporary changes, and they, based on the level of risk, they decide the time when they will go and review that temporary change. If that temporary change is planned for 30 days, they have, I don't know, just as an example, they have a check every 2 weeks on the risk level. They review the scenario if there is any change or there is any impact on the scenario that they assess at the beginning, and that is quite useful and is very easy to implement, and the way that they are doing it at the moment, and it's working well, especially for these turnaround temporary changes scenarios where people tend to forget after the turnaround, let's say, finished, and we are struggling to get the information done. That is, I'm more concerned for these, let's say, decisions where we want to produce or we want to keep producing and somebody decides to do a temporary change, and then that decision becomes reality without any kind of assessment, and usually the assessment is done afterwards. Okay, that is a problem.
Yeah,
usually.
yeah. I mean, I think it's preferable that the assessment is done before, but even if the assessment is done after, as long as it's done as close as possible to implementing the change. But I have seen a lot of times when we implement a change and it's not until somebody new comes along and they say, well, what is this? And you go, oh, well, this is, and then you realize it was a change. And that's part of the problem, is actually recognizing that you have had a change, because
Exactly.
sometimes it's quite difficult. So you've had a question in. I can go to, yeah. So what would be the best way forward for performing risk assessment of MOC? I do normally a mini HAZOP, but would be great if you can introduce any template or tool. So Charlie, have you used anything?
Well, basically we have, in some places we call it like a urgent MOC quick sheet, or urgent MOC fast sheet, fast assessment. Is basically is taking people through the different steps that they're supposed to follow on their implemented system, but they have to do it, let's say, quick. It's just some sort of checklist to avoid forgetting about critical steps like the risk assessment, the level of risk authorization, let's say, or the acceptance that they have. We have certain templates that we can share at some point without any problem. That will help, let's say, to have a process in place. The approach is a checklist approach, basically going through the system that they have implemented, but is done. We have a minimum number of people involved. We go through the steps. We have certain criteria for the risk assessment, even though it's a quick one, I would say, or something that's urgent in many cases. we try to have priority on that exercise just to understand the risk that we are taking. And we can share a template, really.
So I've seen two types of sort of temporary changes implemented. One is what some people call an operational risk assessment. So this is a type of change, but for example, if you have 12 gas detectors in an area and 3 of them are not working, you would do an operational risk assessment to determine whether it was safe enough to continue to operate. And I can provide over the next week or 2, I can give you a template for an operational risk assessment. This is typically done when one of your safety systems or one of your normal systems is not working and you want to see whether it's okay to continue to operate without it. And then the second type of temporary change is where you actually have to change something. So an example for this was we had a heat exchanger and the bursting disc, which routed cooling water to the drains, that ruptured during operation, but it was a few days before the turnaround. And so the question was, well, we're going to have the turnaround, we can replace the bursting disc then. If we need to replace the bursting disc now, we're going to have to shut down the whole train because that was a critical cooling. Now, we were still achieving cooling because the water was still going through the exchanger through the bursting disc into the thing. We were still achieving the temperature. So we put in place a temporary MOC to route the water from the bursting disc into a nearby drain and therefore still achieving the temperature. When we had the shutdown, they changed the bursting disc. So that's something which might be classified as a change rather than an operational risk assessment. And again, yes, I would say that you should be cautious to not do HAZOP on everything because not everything is a HAZOP. Most of my MOCs that I've implemented in the past have actually been more hazard. We've done what-if studies, we've done dropped objects. Sometimes it's just a case of reviewing the bow ties. We don't have to get all together. We know it's already a specific thing on bow tie. We just review that and update. And then, yes, often we do these mini HAZOPs 2 to 4 hours to review. So just really understanding actually what is changing, whether it is a change, and then what it could potentially impact. And it's really good if in your facility, the list of tier 1 or tier 2 documents, if you don't know what I'm referring to, let me know. But the key critical operating documents are listed. And you can say, okay, for this change, is it impacting any of these or any of these? And if it's impacting one of those 2, it's probably indicating you might need to go into more detail with your risk assessment. The other thing that can indicate you need to go into more detail is when you do the primary risk assessment, i.e. risk before the change, and it's coming up as a high severity, that could also indicate to you that you need to review some of these tier 1 and tier 2 documents. So yeah, so it depends on the change. We do the mini HAZOPs, but don't overdo it because people get fed up with them. And if you try to put HAZOP methodology on something that's not associated with the process, it becomes a bit of a pointless workshop.
Yeah. One thing to mention on this one, we have certain golden rules, especially for urgent changes. And that is very important to highlight that sometimes we overuse the term urgent just to jump a little bit on the process and not follow the process in the way that we're supposed to follow it. One thing that we have as a golden rules is every time that we have a temporary change, we need to have at least, depends on the change anyways, but at least is somebody from engineering, somebody from operations, and somebody from maintenance and HSE or process safety, just to, let's say, be sure that you have the proper kind of brainstorming, especially when you are assessing the risk, because what I found in many times is that sometimes people that is assessing the risk doesn't know the process. And that is very dangerous because sometimes we look at things just based on our own experience and we made mistakes. And that usually is a very dangerous situation. That's why the golden rule is to have that number of people involved, at least in the brainstorming and the risk assessment. and then based on the risk, having the right approval before we move on. Because sometimes we assume that we need to produce at any, let's say, cost, and then is how we pay the price with major accidents.
So I have another question here. So changes are normally classified as permanent, temporary, or emergency. Which are we talking about? So with regards to the risk assessment, they're applicable to all the types of changes. Whether you do permanent, temporary, or emergency, the level of risk assessment might be different. And as Charlie mentioned, the people attending might be different, but all of them require a risk assessment. If a temporary or emergency change requires a HAZOP, then it's the call of the operations manager or the person who's in charge to decide whether they feel that they could implement the change for X number of hours before the HAZOP is convened. There is always an option to override the normal processes of management of change, but that is a call for the operations manager based on the situation that you're in, whether you think, okay, well, we can do this now and then we can assess afterwards and make any adjustments. It's really deciding what the actual risk is at that time.
One comment for Renee here is, we are, let's say, this PSM forum was focused on temporary changes. However, in many cases, I will speak based on my own experience, is that we use the emergency framework to do temporary changes. That's why sometimes it's difficult to disconnect that, because it's very linked to the culture of the organization. But in many cases, people look for, I would say, shortcuts on the MOC process, and they use the emergency framework to do temporary changes.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen temporary changes which require temporary changes, applied to that change. Yeah. Because as we start implementing, we start realizing there's a problem. And the root cause of that is we didn't really consider the temporary change. So I have another question here. So in mentioned case, the emergency change requires HAZOP. Can analysis be done after implementation of emergency change? Yes, that is possible. It is strongly advised not to, but if the operations manager sees that the risk associated with not implementing the change is higher than the risk of implementing the change, and that the HAZOP or whatever risk assessment could be done after this, there must be some form of risk assessment, but if the more detailed can happen after, that decision can be made by the person in charge who is accepting liability for that asset.
Yeah, and this question is, I think that is quite important, because one thing that I want to highlight, and this happened to us all the time, the question is, can we do the change and or complete the paperwork after? I always say yes, but the thing is, we need to understand before the change the risk that we are taking. And that is something that we cannot jump and leave it for, let's say, to be completed after. That's why it's important to be completely sure on the risk that we are taking with that change. The exercise or how we do it or how we assess that situation is really, really important, because sometimes people is more concerned about completing the paperwork than really assessing the risk that they are taking. And it's, I think that is a very good question, because this happened quite a lot. These people saying, oh, we have the change, we already identify it's not risky, let's go ahead and then we complete the work. No problem, but we need to be sure about the level of risk that we are taking.
Yeah, I mean, I think in any decision that I've seen made on the assets I've worked on, where there has been so much pressure to do something without risk assessment, it has always gone wrong afterwards. And I'm not saying that we've had a loss of containment, we've killed somebody, but in some cases, actually, we damaged the equipment we made a change on to a higher cost than the deferred production would have been if we'd taken a shutdown, because we have permanently damaged the equipment because we didn't go through the risk assessment and understand what the risk of doing the change was. Yeah. I mean, there's been cases where we've put in temporary measures, and those temporary measures have caused injury to somebody because we haven't actually thought of the risks associated with the temporary measures. So there's two types of risks you need to think about. There's the risks to the equipment that you're making the change on and the sort of process risks. But then there's also the other risks. I mean, if you're running cables or running hoses, those are trip hazards, etc. If you do it in a temporary manner, you may not take the normal care that you do. And those things do still need to be taken care of. And as we've said in this call already, most temporary changes last longer than we think. So if you think it'll be okay for 24 hours, make sure it's okay for 7 days, because it lasts longer.
Yeah, I think that in this point, we need to be very pessimistic every time that we calculate, let's say, time for temporary changes. It's, as Louise says, if we are planning for 3 months, let's go for 6, or let's implement that for 6 months at least.
I mean, what I saw work really well was where the asset manager really challenged us and said, can it really only go for 3 months? Right? And then we would think as an engineering team is, well, we thought it might go for 3 months because the parts are going to take 2 months to get here. It gives us a month to implement. But actually, this change could maybe be implemented for 6 months because it's safe, because we've done the risk assessment, we understand the risk. And for this type of equipment, that is sufficient. But in other cases, when they've challenged us, we maybe have gone back and said, okay, well, we said 3 months because that's how long the things are going to take. But actually, during that 3 months, we could have enhanced corrosion, and therefore we need to be having it as a short period. And if we have to shut down because we can't get the parts. And then if you give that sort of information to management, it allows people to make decisions to support you. So if you say it's only going to be 2 months, even though the part's going to take 3 months, they can pay to expedite the part and get the people on site in time. I've also seen another facility that just assumes that all temporary changes are permanent. So whenever they do an assessment, they just assume it will be permanent. So that's another way of managing with temporary change.
Yeah, it's I will raise one subject that for me has been one of the most common temporary changes. Just let me write this here just to keep it visible for everyone. You can show it as a question if you want. Okay. Yeah, it's that is basically, let's talk about temporary production facilities. That's is something that, in my experience, especially in the E&P, is one of the most common and dangerous temporary changes that we have on new facilities or linked to existing facilities, and we come with these early production facilities, a separator, a couple of valves, things like that, and people believe, oh yeah, that will be for a couple of months, and then we end up having 2 or 3 years an early production facility waiting for the project to be completed, and we face issues like, well, in my case, one of the one that I remember is a flare carryover, just because somebody decided to block the inlet and outlet ESDB valves because that was closing too often and the location was remote, and somebody decided just to block the air to keep the valves open. The oil was coming, increasing the level, and we end up having all the oil going to the flare. Just one example of these temporary production facilities that usually are very long-term, well, in some cases at least. Have you faced something like that, Louise, in the past?
Yes, we had some things where we needed to get water to the plant, and we didn't have permanent facilities for doing that, and we needed to put in temporary facilities, which was fine. They were supposed to last for 6 months because the project was supposed to complete the water processing plant. They lasted for 18 months. During that time, there was there was higher oxygen content in the water than there should have been because obviously it didn't have the right processing. And as a result, we had enhanced corrosion on one of the exchanges.
Exactly. Those are, and that this, you just mentioned something that sometimes we don't perceive as a temporary change, that is chemical injection. That is another topic that comes to temporary changes when somebody said, okay, let's increase a little bit the chemical injection, or let's decrease the chemical injection, and we end up having bacteria in all our tanks, and then having corrosion things or problems with pyrophoric material, blah blah blah, just because of that temporary small change without any kind of assessment.
Yeah, recognizing the change is often the most difficult thing.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing how we are struggling. We are still struggling quite a lot with the MOC process and recognizing changes and the acceptance of the process. We are always finding that reluctancy to follow the MOC process in the right way.
Yeah, I think when it starts working really well, it's really easy to follow, but it does take a lot of effort to make it work well. So we have another question, which is how to make sure that temporary change will be properly withdrawn. So Charlie, have you any experience of this working well?
Well, that usually, we have a couple of clients that they have a quite simple process, and they always have their cycle, review cycle, where they review temporary changes, and they update their documentation and things like that, and they finally close the case. Everything is managed as a case on their system. That is working well. But at the same time, we found many clients that these are findings coming out from audits. The auditor is coming and they find temporary changes without any kind of, let's say, closeout process or something like that. Yeah, it's again, in many cases, at least in our experience with certain companies, is many people is concerned about starting the process. They upload the information, they start the MOC process, but then the follow-up and closing become part of the problem, just because they don't have KPIs to see, let's say, or to measure that lack of closeout or lack of closeout and actions and things like that. Yeah, we are facing both sides of this process, and we have companies that make it very simple and they are doing very well, and then we have companies that are having the system very high-tech system, everything is working well, but people is not using it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've probably got the same sort of mix of experience as you. The thing that I've seen work really well is where the asset or facility manager is actually interested in the number of temporary changes that are live.
Yeah.
And if you just bear in mind that the number of temporary changes live on your system is a leading process safety indicator.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a large number of temporary changes being raised monthly, being executed and live on your system, that is an indication that you don't have any control of what's going on in your facility. If you have a couple, things happen, right? That's not a problem. But if you're having a lot, that's an indication that you have a problem with your design, a problem with your maintenance, or a problem with how you operate your facility. Because your facility should not require a large number of changes all the time. If you have that, you have a problem. Okay. And if you also have 0 changes being raised, either temporary or permanent or emergency, that is also an indication that you have a problem, because people are not telling you that they need a change. They're just doing it. Okay. So, but what I've seen work really well is we have our MOC meeting. And during the MOC meeting, we have a very strict structure. We review any new MOCs which have come through. We make sure that they're risk assessed before they come to the meeting. And then we say, okay, whether we're going to screen them to go forward, are we going to approve some preliminary engineering work or not? Then once they're screened to go forward, we then move on to the ones which were previously screened, which now have the engineering work done. Are we going to move them forward to further engineering to mature or not? Right. And then once those are done, we get to the stage where further engineering is completed and the technical authorities have reviewed and made sure that the change meets the required standards and local legislation, and then we implement. But having that sort of structure in the meeting, and then at the end of the meeting, before we end, we say, okay, well, these are the temporary changes which were supposed to expire in the next 3 weeks. What is the plan with them? Let's update, right? That is the structure of the MOC meeting, and we have that at a regular interval. And then there's a separate meeting where we have a look back and say, okay, well, maybe the last month, the last 2 months, the last 3 months, whatever is appropriate for your facility. How many changes were raised? How many are stuck in implemented and not closed? Because what can happen, as Charlie said, is you can get a certain way along, and then everything kind of gets stuck there. Maybe your document control is not working well. Maybe your engineers are so focused on implementing things, they're not updating. But actually that means that in your facility, the drawings, the information you're using is out of date because you're not putting the information from these changes into those documents. So having that sort of regular review, however often is appropriate for the number of changes you raise at your facility, those two things have, I've seen, really improve the culture about management of change. And then the other thing is education, right? Making sure people understand what a temporary, what a permanent change is, and what closure of a temporary change is, and chasing up to make sure that they've got that closure plan.
Yeah.
I have another question here. One of the issues I have come across regarding MOC is the MOC culture. Employees prefer to implement the change without any paperwork. Would be good to share your experience of improving this culture. Charlie?
Well, usually when we have these kind of questions, I always ask people to understand why we perceive a process or we don't follow a process. Usually, typical example of based on our experience is people see a distance between them and the process. That means that they never been involved in the process. They never been explained the importance of the process. We usually provide this kind of one-way training where we explain a whole lot of information that nobody understands. We stay there for a couple of hours and that's it. We never cross-check their understanding on the process and how or what is their role into the process. And then another thing is leadership. Is always, every time that we face something like this, is like what happened with procedures, is a leadership failure. People do what leaders allowed to be done, basically. That's why, based on our experience and the places that we improve the culture, usually is bringing people closer to the processes, explaining them how they play their part, how important are they in the process, because otherwise we will keep facing the same problems because people is just instructed to apply something that in many cases they don't see the value, and they don't see the value because they never understood completely the value of the process. It's a very, I would say, very simple and at the same time complicated action, but it's basically explaining how they play their part and involve them into the process more and more. They need to feel the ownership. That is the only way that we found to improve, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I've often seen people wanting to implement changes without the paperwork, but they never want to implement the changes without the approval of the manager or the approval of the engineers. But now, just remember that when an engineer signs a management of change to get implemented, they are signing to say that the standards and the local legislation applicable to that change have been implemented, and they will be held accountable in a court of law if that is not true and an incident happens. When I start talking like that to the engineers, they go, I'm not sure I'm ready to sign yet. Should we do the risk assessment? Right? So really explaining what their role is. What are they signing for? They are not signing for budgetary approval. That is not their role. The budget approver is a separate person to the engineers. When you start explaining what the engineer is signing for, and you make sure you have that segregation in your process, engineers are approving the technical validity of the change. Whether there's two stages, one is to say, yep, I agree that this change is a good idea. And then second, when all the engineering is done, the engineers are signing to say the engineering that has been done meets what is required to be met for this type of change. It's not everything, for this type of change. When they sign that, if an incident happens, those people who have signed to approve can be held liable. And it depends on the country how liable and how effective the implementation of the legislation is, but they can be held liable. So making sure people actually, as Charlie said, understand their role, right? Understand how it impacts their liability. And also then coming from the other side is understand how that could impact the weakening of barriers on their facility and impact the potential that they might not go home in one piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've had another question. In that case, could not be applied proper documentation management. So this is in support of the one before. Yeah, so I think there's two parts to this document thing. So I've seen problems in both parts. The first one is that people want to implement the change without the red line documents, the risk assessment being implemented. And then there's the second problem, which I've seen. Once it's implemented, people forget about the change, right? It's done, right? No, it hasn't been closed, right? So then we need to make sure that all of those red line documents and that are filed in the right place, are updated to the right documents. That part is often the part that is forgotten because the change has happened. We're receiving the benefit of this change. It's improved production. It's whatever is happened. It's great, yeah. But the document follow-up is really important. And then also it's important to know there's differences between changes implemented during construction, changes implemented during operation, and changes implemented during projects, because closure in each of those means different things. Charlie?
No, it's one thing that came to my mind that I usually struggle a lot are the famous punch list. Basically, all the pendings that we keep growing and growing, coming from projects that do changes or not, or in many cases don't adjust to what they designed at the beginning, and they made these changes, and we start having this punch list of items that in many cases stay there forever. That's why if you go to any organization, I always try to challenge people and do this typical, let's say, topic for holding MOC actions is update technical documentation. Most of the organizations struggle quite a lot to update PIDs, update cause and effect matrix, I don't know, update drawings, etc., etc. Is for some reason we have big, medium, or small companies. Everybody struggle just to close that action when they need to update the technical documentation, and they keep adding more and more actions. And at some point, somebody come with a what we call PHA campaigns, or I don't know, technical documentation update campaign, or MOC closing out campaigns, or whatever, and you start having some update. But that usually happen after years of just having that pending actions.
Yeah, I mean, I've typically seen PNIDs updated sort of 6 monthly. So the engineers have a look at them every 6 months. They have a look at which MOCs have been implemented, and then they update them then. So they have a sort of routine. The doc controllers know that some drawings will be updated in that period, and then so they update like that. And then every 5 years after the HAZOP or before the HAZOP, a big update is happening to the drawings as well. But I think it's really important to have some sort of regular routine. You just check, right? You might find that no MOCs have been implemented and you don't need to do any updates, but you might go, okay, well, yeah, no, there's been 4, 5, 1, and then I just need to update those drawings and then it's done, right? The other way I've seen it done is as an MOC happens, those drawings are then submitted for update. Obviously, that's a lot tidier because things don't fall through the cracks. You might not miss. So, and the key for that is when the engineer approves that it's technically feasible, the documents that are attached are the red line documents to the documents that need to be updated. And so therefore, once it's implemented, they get a little bit of feedback from site in case there was some change in the way they implemented. And then that drawing is ready. They don't have to think about it. They don't have to draw it up. It's ready just to go to doc control. So this is update that needs to happen. Right. So doing the work up front, being really clear about what's required, making sure that authorities have that drafted before they go live and implement, that is the key to good management of change.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and some places where we applied, trying to kill two birds with one stone, is we agreed the operator redline their PNIDs usually while they are doing their workarounds during every 3 months. They are just bringing the PNID in case there is any modification. They keep the PNIDs there. At some point, engineering team grab those PNID, as Louise mentioned, every 6 months or every 3 months or every year. But basically, that is training people to walk the line, as we call it. Then you are having a very accurate, let's say, an operational review, because at some point that becomes some sort of training at the same time. It's like doing many things with just one action, and it's very powerful, at least for PNIDs, or sometimes we apply the same thing for board operators or control room operators. We do the review on the cost matrix, the cause and effect matrix, and things like that. Or sometimes we review screens, things like that, that will help on these temporary changes, and we can find temporary changes that were forgotten from 20 years ago. That is happening more and more, especially in old facilities, that we have these kinds of reviews and we find things that nobody knew that were there. And that is dangerous, really. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that I read from the CCPS overview on good process safety management is when you do training, use the information from your facility. Exactly. So this is something I've always tried to do when we are doing process safety training. I use the bow ties from the facility where people are working to explain to them the major accident hazards at their site, not at the site down the road, not at the site, the well pads. No, at their site where they are operating, what are the hazards there? If you are doing any training for operators and it's training for a glycol package or an upstream separator, well, why don't you just use the ones use the drawings which are available for your facility? Use the process description available for your facility. When you use those documents to do the training, that's when you start getting feedback. But hey, that's not how it works in practice or whatever. That's a really good way of getting feedback, and people are actually understanding what the system is.
Yeah, it's those are different strategies, just trying to have people more involved and being part of the process. Yeah, it's wow, time's flight, really.
It has. So we haven't had any more questions. I give you a little chance to ask another one, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an introduction to what next week's topic is. If we have another question, we can answer that afterwards. But next week's topic, very exciting, is safety critical elements in practice. Now, if you don't know what safety critical elements are, please join. But in general, they are the things that we need to manage major accident hazards. So the high hazard events, they are either preventing or mitigating the consequences associated with those high hazard events. And we're going to have someone that I've worked with in the past who is really, really knowledgeable on this area, and that's Peter Van Plu. He's going to join us. He has been working for over 20 years in this type of area, especially associated with startup and commissioning, and checking that these safety critical elements are actually working before handing over the plant, and then classifying them and using all sorts of different systems. So he's really knowledgeable, and we're really lucky to have him next week. as I mentioned, the next week will be at an earlier time to try and allow people from elsewhere to join. But I'm really excited for next week, and I'm sure that we will get a completely different perspective on safety critical elements, drawing from Peter's experience.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
He's that is a subject that is very interesting, really.
Yeah, and I also issued a video this week about how you can sort of make your facility better for post-COVID-19. So, you know, reducing the maintenance workload. If you have incorrectly identified your hazards and your safety critical elements, your maintenance load may be much higher than it needs to be to safely manage your facility. So if you missed that video, have a look on the channel, and also join next week when Peter will be giving us some details about how you really identify the elements which manage your facility rather than just the generic ones. I've seen lots of interesting things, but we'll save that for next week.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as we don't have any more questions and it's nearly time, Charlie, I propose we close unless you have anything else you want to add.
No, just want to say thanks to the people that connect, and really it's becoming very useful, because at the same time we get feedback during all these questions and answer sessions. Is really interesting to see what are the concerns that people is having.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for joining. And we look forward to seeing you next time, hopefully at the earlier time slot.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'll put a survey up if you do have time.